So with this video on the endocrine system, I'm going to focus on these glands here. I'll start with the thyroid, then I'll talk about the back of the thyroid, the parathyroid. We'll look at the pancreas and the pineal gland. I also want to talk about some glands that have secondary endocrine functions, meaning that their primary focus in life is not actually secreting hormones, but in some other role. The pancreas is a great example of that. Its primary role in the body is as a digestive organ, but it also secretes insulin and glucagon, which are hormones that are critical to blood glucose stabilization. So as I go, for each hormone that I talk about, make sure that you can talk about some of its key functions, that you know the gland from which it's secreted, and that you also know where that hormone is headed. So what are its target organs and or organ? So with the thyroid, it's a butterfly-shaped gland that sits just under the thyroid prominence, so just under what some people refer to as your Adam's apple. And so here's your thyroid. And if you look at the histology, what you see, some key features, is you have all of these follicles that are surrounded by follicular cells. And it's inside these follicles where colloid is made. And colloid is where you are able to generate active forms of thyroid hormone, specifically T3 and T4. So with T3 and T4, their primary goal is to regulate metabolism. And so as a consequence, when you think about the target organs of thyroid hormone, you're really talking about every cell in the body. And so key functions of thyroid hormone are going to be to tell cells when to consume oxygen and nutrients, how much to consume. They really regulate energy levels of cells in our body. If we need more energy, then our body will do its best to put out T3 and T4. And so what I want to highlight with this picture is it's a chain reaction. And so thyroid gland is going to secrete thyroid hormone when the pituitary gland up here tells it to do so. So if you recall from the lecture on the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary secretes, the text is cut out, but thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid. And so what the thyroid does is it basically monitors the environment. And if it determines that energy levels, metabolism has fallen or risen, it will either increase the TSH that's released, and therefore the T3 and T4 that's released, or it will decrease the TSH that's released and the T3 and T4. And so people who may experience hypothyroidism oftentimes have to determine if the source of their condition is the thyroid gland itself, or potentially the anterior pituitary upstream. So it's possible to take thyroid stimulating test where TSH will be administered exogenously in the bloodstream. And so if administering TSH leads to a sudden boost in T3 and T4 levels, then a physician can determine that it's actually the pituitary gland that's the issue and not anything going on with the thyroid gland. Conversely, if TSH is given and there's no increase in T3 and T4, that means that this is the link that is experiencing some sort of trouble, and then the doctors and physicians can troubleshoot accordingly. But to elaborate more on T3 and T4, with metabolism, you also want to think about growth and development. So this includes, again, just about every cell in the body. The hormones that are released contain iodine. You may have heard of goiters or seen somebody who has a goiter or a growth on their thyroid. And in individuals who are malnourished, what's oftentimes going on is they're not getting enough iodine. And so if they're not getting enough of this critical mineral, then the pituitary will keep secreting thyroid stimulating hormone. But what happens is that the thyroid gland isn't able to make functioning T3 and T4. The colloid in these follicles begins to fill. It keeps getting stimulated upstream by the TSH, but because it's unable to secrete active functioning T3 and T4 without the iodine. The colloid fills, and it can lead to the growth on the neck. And it's easily treated. A little bit of iodine in the diet, good sources of that come from seafood, will usually clear that up. So increases in basal metabolic rate, as well as heat production. So the calorigenic effects of T3 and T4. And again, it's also going to play a role in regulating growth and development. On the posterior side of the thyroid glands, you have parathyroid glands. And the number of glands in this region can actually vary from one individual to another. But the critical thing to remember about parathyroid hormone is that it's going to work to regulate or to maintain calcium levels in the body. That is so critical that we do that, because if you think about it, if you think back to learning about muscle contraction or the firing of an action potential, in order for a neurotransmitter to be released, calcium is going to be involved in that at the presynaptic terminal. There's a number of places where calcium also comes in with muscle contraction as well. So if calcium levels fall or if they grow too high, it can affect the transmission of nerve impulses, muscle contraction. It also ties into blood clotting. So we've really got to maintain calcium within a very narrow range. And PTH is one of the key players here. So what I'm going to look at now are some of the mechanisms through which PTH works. And I'm sorry, parathyroid hormone, maybe this goes without saying, but this is the hormone that's released from these parathyroid glands. Recall that para just means around. So we're literally saying that these are glands around the thyroid. So what PTH is really going to do is it's going to increase calcium levels in the blood. And so what you're seeing here is a sequence of events starting with, to begin with, a hypocalcemia, so low blood calcium. PTH will be released from the parathyroid gland, and it acts on it acts not only on the kidneys, but also on your skeletal system. So if you recall from previous courses, osteoclast, so osteoblast build bone, they lay it down. Osteoclast carve it out. Bones are one of the huge reservoirs in our body for storing calcium. And so if blood calcium levels fall, we're going to pull that out of our bones. And so you actually see that PTH works to increase osteoclast activity. And so as a result, you get calcium and phosphorus that's going to be released into the blood. There are two key mechanisms through which PTH is going to work via the kidneys to bump up calcium levels. One of that is simply to increase calcium reabsorption in the kidney tubules. In the nephrons in the kidney, it's going to allow for more of that calcium to be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream and less of it to be excreted. So that's one key route. And the other is by activating vitamin D. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow for our bodies to better absorb calcium that we take in our diet, so in our small intestine. A nice connection here, if you supplement with calcium, most calcium supplements will include vitamin D, because that vitamin D is going to help our bodies better take in the calcium that we ingest. And so through all three of these mechanisms, we will ultimately work, or PTH ultimately works to increase calcium in the blood. If this were the opposite, and an individual had too much calcium in the blood, what we usually see is that PTH release is going to be inhibited. So you have less of this released and less of this going on. So the pancreas is one of those organs that is really a secondary endocrine gland. Again, its main function is as a digestive organ. A lot of the exocrine function coming through this pancreatic duct and being released into the small intestine. So a lot of digestive enzymes that are going to help us to better break down food and absorb it through that intestinal lining. So that's the exocrine function of the pancreas. What I'm honing in on here is the endocrine function, or how it's involved with the hormones. From a histology standpoint, when you're looking at a slide of the pancreas, you want to focus in on the pancreatic islets here. This is where you're going to find the alpha cells that are going to produce glucagon and the beta cells that are going to produce insulin. This is the most comprehensive way to illustrate everything that's going on here. You have negative feedback loops that are shown really clearly here. And I think if you can explain this to somebody else, you've got a really good grasp on how this all works. So this would be balanced blood glucose levels. So if blood glucose levels rise, what we're going to see is that the beta cells in the pancreas are going to release insulin. Now I have this note. So insulin is a hypoglycemic. So hypo meaning low, glycemic meaning sugar agent. Not meaning that it's released when blood sugar is low, but rather because it's an agent of hypoglycemia, it's going to trigger blood sugar to drop. And so one of the ways through which insulin works is it is going to allow for glucose to be converted to glycogen, so a storage form of sugar in the liver cells. If this was in a plant, that glucose would be converted to starch. But in humans, glucose is stored as glycogen. Recall that glucose is precious to the central nervous system. So we don't excrete glucose in our urine. That's a clinical sign of diabetes if you have glucose in your urine. So any extra glucose that we get from our diet, we're going to hang on to, and we're going to figure out how to store it. For better or worse, we're going to store that. So glucose goes into glycogen. Insulin allows for that. The other big thing that insulin is going to do is it works on other cells in our body. And it's basically just going to stimulate those cells to be able to take in glucose. So somebody, let's say with type 1 diabetes who doesn't make enough insulin, they may experience really high blood sugar because their cells don't have the insulin to be able to get that glucose from the blood into their cells. So their cells are crying out for glucose. And even though their bloodstream is swimming with excess levels, that excess glucose can't be transported into the cells without that insulin. And so through these two pathways, blood glucose levels are going to fall back to normal. We'll take a look at this lower half here. So if blood glucose levels fall, and many of us experience this on a daily basis. It could be something as simple as having dinner at 8 and maybe having a late breakfast the next day, or maybe being busy or doing intermittent fasting and skipping breakfast. But either way, if your blood sugar falls, what our body does to ensure that we keep that level is the alpha cells in our pancreas are going to secrete glucagon. That's the key hormone. So this has opposite effects from insulin. And so another way of saying that is to say that they have antagonistic effect. So insulin is the hormone that lowers blood sugar. Glucagon is the hormone that raises blood sugar. And so it can also be called a potent hyperglycemic agent. So hyper meaning high, you could think hyperactive, hypothermia, to give you another root word there, right? Somebody whose body temperature has dropped too much. So a potent hyperglycemic agent, and it's going to do the opposite. It stimulates the liver to break down that glycogen to get glucose. This is a term that we're going to see in the next chapter, and just break it down. So glycogenolysis. So it is literally, if you cut it right here, we're saying glycogen lysis. And so we are literally saying we are splitting, lyse, the glycogen to release that glucose. And as a result, blood glucose levels are going to come back to where they should be. The pineal gland. So this one is kind of a pine nut shaped gland that sits just superior to the corpora quadrigemina, to the superior and inferior colliculi. So it's shown approximately right here in the brain. And the key thing with the pineal gland from an endocrine standpoint is that it releases melatonin. So that's the main hormone. Melatonin its endocrine functions still aren't completely understood, but one of the things that we do know is that it plays a key function in regulating circadian rhythms. The concentrations of melatonin that are released from the pineal gland really follow that daily cycle, circadian rhythms. One of the things that could be useful here in a lot of real life applications is that the pineal gland receives input from visual pathways. And so what happens is light actually suppresses the production of melatonin from our pineal gland. So many applications of this. What are the reasons that it's good to be in a dark room, to limit exposure to electronic devices, especially blue light, that can work to actually suppress the melatonin. It makes it more difficult for us to fall asleep if there's less melatonin that's present. Being in a very, very dark room when you're trying to sleep, or for babies trying to sleep as well, it also applies to them, especially when they're trying to regulate their circadian rhythms. That any bit of light coming in can also suppress melatonin. It also helps to explain why with jet lag, it can be so much worse to adjust if you're traveling from west to east, where you're being forced to fall asleep, where you lose time and you're trying to go to sleep before you're really tired because of those circadian patterns. As a contrast, when you're traveling from east to west, the reason that tends to be a little bit easier is you've gained time. You're trying to stay up a little bit longer, and you have the sunlight coming in and working to suppress the melatonin. So it's a little bit easier to stay awake when you don't have as much melatonin building than it is to force yourself to go to sleep when you're not tired. So last slide here is looking at organs that have, or really focusing just a bit, giving you a little teaser of some of the organs out there that have secondary endocrine functions. And some of these may surprise you. The skin and the heart, they release some hormones too. The GI tract and the mucosa that we'll take a look at there, it's also going to secrete hormones that are going to be really critical to our digestive processes. The gonads, right? Their primary role is with the reproductive system. But yet, if you ask somebody to name some hormones, you're typically going to hear estrogen and progesterone and testosterone right off the bat, right? But certainly those gonads, their goal is to make more babies and not strictly to do this. Not that they certainly don't go hand in hand, but just a different way of thinking about these hormones. Adipose tissue is kind of a neat one. So fat in our body, you may have heard of leptin. So it works with our central nervous system, and it actually helps to produce feelings of fullness or satisfaction. And so what they found is that the higher percent body fat an individual has, typically the more leptin that you'll see in the blood. And the hypothalamus is going to be that region in our brain that regulates hunger, that regulates thirst. And so it makes sense that leptin would have a target organ, would have a target binding site in the hypothalamus to help with appetite control. Also some cool connections here with emotions, right? Emotional eating, some connections here with the hypothalamus. With the kidneys, you will see this again, erythropoietin or EPO. What that does is it actually increases red blood cell levels. You may have heard of endurance athletes. Cyclists have gotten a bad rep for doping with EPO, but the more red blood cells you have, the more oxygen carrying capacity that you have. We'll look a little bit more at EPO when we get to the chapter on blood, but just again, a little teaser here that the kidneys even have an endocrine function in releasing EPO.